Okay, hello everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that our guest Siang Lu lives and works on Yagara and Turrbal country. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people watching today. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it would be great too if audience members could share in the chat whose land you're watching from tonight as well. I also feel I need to note that we're having this conversation on the 606th day of an ongoing genocide, that settler colonialism defines our present as well as our past, and that this context inevitably informs the way we operate as writers and as people who are speaking about writing tonight. So my name is Kate Blair, and I'm a writer and the mentor for this year's Toolkits fiction program. And tonight I'll be speaking with Siang Lu. So Siang Lu is the author of Ghost Cities and the Whitewash and the creator of #SillyBookstagram. The Whitewash won the ABIA Audiobook of the Year in 2023. Ghost Cities has been longlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award and the ALS Gold Medal, and shortlisted for the Russell Prize for Humour Writing, the VPLA John Clarke Humour Award, the Readings New Australian Fiction Prize, and the University of Queensland Fiction Book Award, and the Courier-Mail People's Choice Queensland Book of the Year at the Queensland Literary Awards. He is based in Brisbane, Australia, and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. This event is part of Express Media's Toolkits program. So for those of you who aren't already aware, Toolkits Connect is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media, and Express has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, such as VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognise excellence. Toolkits Connect is generously supported by Copyright Cultural Fund and Australian Poetry. This session will be available on YouTube as a resource and will be captioned in the coming days. And if you'd like to ask any questions, you can do so on Twitter using the hashtag #EMToolkits or via the live chat section on YouTube. And I encourage you to put in any questions that you like into that chat as well. So, welcome, Siang. I thought I might start by asking a question which springs from your bio. What does it mean to live across both Brisbane and Kuala Lumpur? Like, do you split your time evenly? And how does this impact your writing?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking that. Before I answer it, I think I might just mention that Anna, for the audience, is also the author of the fantastic book, The Modern, which I read and loved. So you should go out and buy that book. And yeah, onto your question. I'm the father of two, so things were a lot easier splitting time between Australia and Malaysia, where I was born. I wasn't born in Kuala Lumpur. For anyone who's familiar with Malaysia, I was born in Kuching, which is on Borneo. It's in East Malaysia. But since probably about 2016 or 2017, we've been really lucky to be able to split time between the two countries. Before my children were born, the way that sort of manifested was sort of like 3 or 4 months out of the year. But as it currently happens with the logistics of schools and so on, we're just sort of more or less at the end of each year, coinciding with school holidays and things like that. The way that it manifests in my writing, it's a really, probably could talk for 45 minutes about that. I think I won't go into this, but the thing that I'm writing about now, like the follow-up to Ghost Cities, which I won't really try not to talk about too much, is about home. And I think in a lot of ways I've been quite obsessed by that concept of belonging. I don't think I would be a writer if I had from the very beginning not felt an innate sense of unbelonging. So it's a tricky and difficult concept for me because, of course, who wouldn't want to belong? Who wouldn't want inherently to not feel the pain of unbelonging? But in its own way, and I hate that it becomes so earnest, like right off the top of the bat. But in its own way, it's the gift that has sort of set me on this artistic life. I find that I do a lot more sort of the nuts and bolts of writing when I'm abroad, and I guess that's because you have different rhythms. I wouldn't call it holiday, but it's sort of a working holiday, and you kind of I'm quite hard on myself. You kind of give yourself permission to stray away from let deadlines lapse a little bit and sort of give yourself more time to write and explore, in fact. So I think I do a lot more sort of exploratory work when I'm abroad. Just before this recording started, I mentioned that I was going to Varuna in a couple of weeks, which I've never been. But and I'm really looking forward to it. But I've never really been the type of person who has gone on a retreat to do the hard work of writing. I've always just, and I guess the tyranny of life is try to write between the cracks and hope that the discipline will sort of carry you through. And when I'm in Malaysia, I feel a lot more free, free to explore sort of anything. I guess as creatives, we can sometimes get, again, probably projecting onto the audience here, but quite hard on ourselves in terms of the output of writing. A lot of people that I talk to, fellow authors, a lot of the conversations around the labor of writing and what's expected is really just like X number of words per day or per week. And I think that's a good goal. And it's always good to have that sort of goal. But things really sort of unlocked for me maybe a few years ago when I stopped feeling that pressure or putting that pressure on myself to say sort of 500 words a day or 1,000, and rather just use the time that was available to me and say this should be an hour or an hour and a half spent in contemplation of the work, and whether or not you write something that really has nothing to do with it. And if you just sort of do that a lot, if you do that every day, which is almost impossible, but if you do that every day, then you will eventually have the work. So I've sort of strayed a little bit from it. I guess that sort of describes who and what I am here, where life is a lot busier, it's a lot more complicated. There's school pickups, there's a day job to navigate, and family life. And I guess, if you sort of transplant that to a place where you have slightly less worries, I think the art will benefit from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I think you said a lot of things in there that are quite interesting as sort of different directions to go in. But one thing you noted was like the fact that your work is about belonging in a lot of ways. And my next question was going to be, because I've read both your books. I'm sure a lot of people watching have, but I think it's always interesting to hear like how writers think of their books as opposed to perhaps how they're marketed or how we as readers think of them. So I think for me, I felt like both The Whitewash and Ghost Cities were essentially kind of like novels of ideas that were quite like playful with form. So if someone asked me to describe them, that's what I'd say. But if somebody asked you to describe your two novels, what would you say?
Yeah, you've given me the answer, and which I gave you. No, it's good. It's a gift. It is. I've said this before, but it makes much more sense to say it now. Again, which is I don't think these books that I've written and the one that I'm writing and the ones that I plan to write could have been written by someone who did not innately feel that sense of unbelonging. And so I guess that's maybe painful way to start it. I don't mean it to be. It's if you can look at it the other way around. I always kick myself, especially because this is recorded, but I'll just say it. I remember I'm very introverted, and I remember being on, the festival circuit for the Whitewash, just when that was new and when I was very new to being an author. And I didn't really want to be on stage. I didn't want to hold a mic in my hand. There's part of me that doesn't want to be on this Zoom, although I'm grateful that I am, and I'm grateful that it's with you, my friend. But it took me a really long time to actually enjoy, in any sense of that word, that environment, which is, it sucks because festivals are great, and I've come to embrace them. And yeah, you can sort of develop so many friendships, and just so many wonderful things happen. But it took me a very long time to sort of get into that mode of understanding what was really even happening. And I think part of that was looking around, and this is not going to make any sense. Maybe it will. I hope it does. But looking around and not, like, I guess inherently I was trying to find the other me. And then I didn't find that person. And that sort of bummed me out for a little while. And then again, it was that kind of thing of looking at myself and realizing I was putting way too much pressure on it. How could I even have expected that? What does that even mean? And in fact, when you rearrange the parameters, you do find the other you everywhere. So many other yous. And I think it helped me unlock this thing that has been really freeing, which is to be able to look at myself and my work and recognize that I should embrace the thing that only I can do, and the work that only I can sort of create, that nobody else could.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. So I thought I might ask first some questions about like your writing and your books, and then some questions about like your relationship to the writing industry and advice you might have for young writers. But obviously there's a lot of overlap across both of those. But I wanted to ask in terms of, so the Whitewash has kind of like provides essentially like a sort of history of cinema with a lot of like fictional events woven in with like factual information. And I was wondering if the novel kind of started with the story or started with the history of cinema, and like what leads you to choose to write something as fiction as opposed to like writing something in the non-fiction exploring the same material?
That's such a good question. And like each time you paused, I wanted to jump in and answer that part. I think inevitably the thing that I end up saying will be far less eloquent, but I'll start by saying that, and this is kind of a joke, but not really, it's absolutely true. My first reader is my wife, Yuan, and she's a big reader, but she's not the biggest fan of my books. Like she is, but she isn't. She's not dying to read my books, put it that way. And over time, this has kind of become sort of a joke, like an in-joke for us. But by which I mean, no, she is a fan of the books and she is greatly supportive. But it's that as a reader, she's a pure reader. She's not that interested in the artistic process that has to be sort of mined through in order to get the final book, whereas I'm obsessed with it. And we had a really interesting sort of experience with this, where in the process of writing The Whitewash, I would go off on all of these weird tangents and get very excited and then have like no one to share the excitement with. And I was getting to, I think, probably like 80% through with the book, and pretty like the end was in sight, and it was kind of a mad race to the finish just through, momentum. That's the weird thing that happens. It's like the book seems interminably endless, until a certain point, and then it suddenly everything picks up and it must be finished. But we went to see, and I'll preface this by saying I don't in any way conflate myself or compare myself to this artist, but we went to see Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And we both loved the film, and we walked out of the film, and Yuan turned to me and she said, with true joy and excitement, "You have to finish your book." And that was the moment where I felt that she got what I was trying to do, which is a really roundabout way of answering a question as to why I didn't just write a thesis, why I didn't just write nonfiction. It was in the interplay between true history and, fiction, which is my first love. And there's so much more that can be achieved with that form, which is a really fancy way of saying you can lie, and have a lot of fun with the lying. So as it happens, I didn't lie all that much. The book is functionally, factually correct, with the exception of maybe, I'd say 20% of it is like wildly incorrect for reasons relating to the art, which all of which was just to amuse me, really. Another way to sort of answer your question was to see the fictional characters and the story that I was trying to build for them as kind of like a Forrest Gump through, Asian representation in history. So they're actually, in the modern day, they're living their lives, and the main action happens within the course of a year or two. But there's a really interesting thing that you can do with editing and intercutting, and just where you place your other components, where you can really just sort of time travel. And so, I don't expect anyone to have really picked this up, but there are, I think, 11 chapters in the book, but more or less the thing that was the guiding principle for me was this should be chapter by chapter an examination of Asian representation in the year of that decade, starting from the birth of cinema in the 1920s till now, which is the 2020s. So that would be essentially a neat 10 chapters. I think it ended up being 11 for reasons I can't remember right now. But that gave me my structure, which is one chapter, one decade. And it became a really fun game to be able to look at what was happening in that decade as a theme. So in the 1920s, the major Asian representation was, a white man. It was a series of white men playing the racist caricature known as Dr. Fu Manchu, which is sort of like the proto Dr. No. Like he's the original evil mastermind with the secret lair and the lasers and all that stuff. And it started me thinking, not at that point, but as I was thinking about what was happening in each decade and what could the theme be, the theme of that decade. And so the first couple of clues for me were in the 1920s with Dr. Fu Manchu was this kind of villainy and the way that being represented in like the Yellow Peril, right? So that was kind of like the big signpost for me, which was the Yellow Peril. And then, and this was a huge revelation to me. I don't know that anyone else cares, but in the 1930s, there was a huge continuation of Fu Manchu into the 30s. Very, very popular franchise. But in the 30s, the thing that sort of took over was Dr. Charlie Chan, which was like this Chinese genius detective, which was like damaging and racist in different ways, even though he was the hero. And so it's really interesting to look at history as well as, I mean, particularly with, I don't know that we want to spend time talking about the Beige Index, but this idea that as time goes on, we become less racist as a society, but even in that less racistness, things are still totally messed up, right? And so the sort of the dominant theme that sort of emerged for me in looking at, the way that Charlie Chan took over the box office was this idea of like the good Asian or the studious Asian, the assimilated Asian. And these two, the thing that blew my mind, I forgot to say, was that a lot of white actors, exclusively white actors. I mean, there are footnotes. There are almost exclusively white actors, fundamentally played Dr. Fu Manchu and Charlie Chan, and one of them played both. And I thought that was very interesting. His name was Warner Oland, a Swedish actor. And I thought, and of course, he's an actor, he's taking roles, and at the time there's no real sense of like this is wrong, but the initial gut feeling was like, how could someone take this role? And it's a dumb question, but that was the thing that got me started. So I guess to kind of wrap up this very, very long and meandering answer was that I wanted there to be a theme for each decade, and then I wanted, much like in prestige TV, I think the sort of the era of Mad Men is sort of over, but it's really interesting to look at those shows and look at the way that I don't really have the vocabulary to talk about this in like a highfalutin way, but like the way that plot A influences plot B and vice versa, I wanted to have in the book and in the audiobook, hopefully people are also picking that up, is that I wanted the theme to be guiding the characters, the fictional characters, and what was going on with them. And so when we talk about the Yellow Peril, that's a dominant theme in the character development of JK Jr., our main character, who is described as not the sharpest tool in the shed, but definitely the hottest. He's an actor who has become the face of this fictional blockbuster Hollywood film, spy film a la Mission Impossible or James Bond, but starring for the first time an Asian male in the lead. And no spoilers, I guess. Well, I'm not sure if it is a spoiler or not, but it's on the title, so he gets whitewashed out of the role. So yeah, that's kind of what I was looking at, was what is the theme that's arising out of this decade of Asian representation, and how can I sort of serve that up to the reader in a way that's compelling and hopefully funny and humorous, but also really truly has an impact on how the fictional characters grow and where the story takes them.
Cool. I'm sorry if I'm moving around a bit. It's because my dog is trying to get my attention.
I should note, and we were saying this before the recording started, but your dog's name is Hetty, which is not named after the Hetty of the Whitewash, but I find that very, very funny.
Yeah, I mean, like my dog is really delighted to have a doppelganger in your book. A doppelganger who's into breaking and entering, which like I think my dog could get into.
Thematic.
Yeah. So I might ask a similar question about ghost cities, but to make it a bit different, I might ask about the process of like researching it. Like what were your because I mean, I think it's got similarly, it has that sort of plot A, plot B aspect, and it has, it's fiction, but it does have a relationship to nonfiction. And reading it, I thought it must have taken a lot in terms of research. So
not as much as the Whitewash. Yeah, so I've definitely felt the need to be rigorous with the research with the Whitewash, so that I could both honor it and then completely, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on this, but like to disrespect the research at the same time. Whereas with Ghost City, well, because it was based on factual events, with Ghost Cities there wasn't necessarily the same pressure, so the research looked very different. With the Whitewash, I did a lot of reading and watching. I think there are more than 200 footnotes in the book, the Whitewash, and more than that in terms of films and TV shows that are referenced, and I watched every single one of them. And I felt the need to. There was a character in there who was a self-professed expert at Asian representation, and I thought, in order for me to accurately portray this person on the page, I sort of have to know as much as they do, which is dumb because I'm not an actor, so I don't know why. I guess it was just a way for me to cosplay being an academic. But with Ghost Cities, there wasn't that sort of pressure. But there's a character in Ghost Cities who, this is not going to make a lot of sense to, people on the call who have not read the book, but he's a rather minor character, and he's like sort of the leader of the retinue of the imperial consort, sort of an empress of sorts, not really, but sort of the kept woman of the emperor. And so the person who sort of leads the staff that looks after her is named the Grand Prolonger of Autumn. And I picked that up from a series of Cambridge histories of ancient China. And that process was very fun, but I didn't spend nearly as long with that in that sort of mindset or mode as I did with the Whitewash. And so there was a specific period of time that I was trying to, if I could, and I ended up, I think, achieving it. But ultimately, even if I didn't, it wouldn't have been a big deal to me. Looking for a chunk of time in actual Chinese history where all of this wild stuff could have happened. And there is, I'm going to get it wrong because it's been so long since the research, but there was a period around the 1200s where there was a real division between the landmass that is currently known as modern China. And so I think it's called the Northern Song, or it could be the Southern Song. So I'm not a very good Chinese person because I can't remember this. But there was one, the Northern and the Southern Song dynasties were concurrent over the different parts of China, if that makes sense. And one of them was like the official one, and then one of them was like, I can't remember which part of China, but one of them was sort of just a series of warlords that really just kind of took their turn ruling every few years. And I thought that's the chaotic place and time that I need this, weird fictional empire and this sort of, it turns out that he's become quite Trump-like. I wasn't thinking about that at the time. This weird emperor who has just extraordinary whims, considers himself an artist. I suppose he is in some respects, but he's extremely extreme. So that was more or less the research, was just kind of diving into a few texts, seeing whether or not there was a time period that could have fit what I wanted, but I wasn't really necessarily beholden to that. If there wasn't a time period that fit, I think ultimately I would have just gone ahead with it. And then if we move on to other weirder forms of research, I never once wanted to reference this in like the pitch for the book or in marketing or anything like that. But a huge part of the book is sort of written in the style of an epic poem. And it's, completely indebted to Milton's Paradise Lost. And there are narrative reasons why it should be like that. But again, looking back at it, it's arguably a self-indulgence. And, John Milton's Paradise Lost was a really big component of the research, which, I took a few goes to try to get into. And I said this once at Port Fairy Literary Festival and then sort of immediately regretted it. But I only said it because Helen Garner was in the audience and I was flipping out. And it has ended up becoming true anyway, having been true the whole time, and is even more true now that I know it, is this idea that I write in order to become a better reader. And the Paradise Lost was unlocked for me when I was writing something about it. And I might be projecting here, but I sort of sense that it's almost the same for you with the modern, where in writing about it, you sort of suddenly you know more about it somehow, or you're giving yourself permission to know more about it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I feel like I shouldn't talk too much about like my own process.
Oh, why
but
not? Let's go about.
I guess because I did a PhD in art history,
Right.
some of that was like a desire to write about art in a way that like people would actually read. Like people don't really read. Like there are some amazing academic articles out there, but the only people who read them are people who are reading them like for their work rather than for pleasure.
I could have just said that. That's like the perfect answer, and it took me like 10 minutes to come to it. You should just give my answers.
Yours was great though. There are like lots of different directions that I want to go in asking you questions about that answer, but also just with an eye on the time, I feel like I should move to some of the more like industry or like the life of a writer kind of questions. So I might ask how you got started as a writer.
Can we skip this one and leave it for the Q&A after?
Yeah.
Which is not recorded.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we could skip that one. I might ask then, I was going to ask about publicity, but you've actually already talked a bit about that. So I might ask what you find to be like the most challenging part of writing and publishing.
Not currently, because it's a fear that I've faced and I feel like I'm in the process of conquering. But I alluded to this before, was it's such a dumb thing, but you spend years writing a book and you dream that it will be published, and then it is, and it's wonderful, but then you have to go and talk about it, and I had never once pictured that, did not really want a bar of it, and then sort of because I have a very good and supportive publisher and an excellent publicist, kind of got chucked into the deep end over and over and over again, until the point where I could eventually find some joy in it. And so it's, that has been the main challenge, trying to figure out, and also looking at it with a more mature lens, recognizing that the industry is in such a way that you can't really get away from it. If you are the type of person like me to not inherently want to be involved in publicity, and that might sound like a strange thing for people on this, watching this, who follow me on Instagram and sort of see that persona of me being like aggressively, I call that persona the idiot, because it's just not me. Well, maybe I am an idiot, but the idea being, the original, let me finish the original thought being that you can't really get away, if you're a shy introverted person, from having to partake in some fashion in publicity. And so that is probably the main thing that I don't necessarily feel pain about any longer, and am grateful for. But I remember very vividly, because it was Marcus Zusak who told me, and I'm in such awe of him, and I just couldn't believe that he was talking to me in the first place. But that's the joy and the wonder of being at a writers' festival like Headlands Writers' Festival, which is a lovely place, and also doesn't have that much around, so that other big, what ends up happening basically when you go to rural festivals is that all the big authors just come to your like panel, and they're just seated in the audience, and you're sitting there freaking the hell out because Marcus Zusak or Benjamin Stevenson has walked into your session, and now you have to say something eloquent. But and I'm going to go on a huge long tangent, so I'll try to cut it short. He said to me at the airport, which again was just such a weird thing because rural airport, there's not really anywhere to do or nothing to do other than to mingle with your fellow authors. So we ended up, me, Danuka McKenzie, and my good friend Kirsty Iltners, was sitting at a table with Marcus Zusak and Gina Chick, and we were just all like three of us looking at each other going like, what the fuck is happening right now? You know, like, but Marcus said that the industry is like in a really interesting spot right now where 10, 15, 20 years ago, this was sort of like the main channel. It was kind of like broadcast TV. There was some authors, and then they were the ones who got sort of uplifted and anointed and you paid attention to. And now we're in an era where like there's all these channels and nobody knows who to tune into, and publicity, which I have weird feelings about, you know, love it or loathe it, is really a way of focusing in on the channel, or sort of making the broadcast signal stronger, if that makes sense. So yeah, I say all this with, you know, like notes of complication in my voice, because I hope, I would want to live in a world where that's not necessary, but I don't live in that world. And so, yeah, it's been a real struggle, and I think that's probably the main one for anyone who's an aspiring author and hasn't really necessarily thought about the public component. You don't have to do that right now, but at some point you will have to confront it. And of course, if you're an extrovert, you're all good. But if you're an introvert like me, it's going to be a bit of a challenge.
That's so interesting. I have to admit, I love the publicity side of things. I think it's so fun doing events. But I always, just based on the fact that you do so many, I assumed that you loved it. So it's fascinating to hear that.
I do not, in fact, love them. You sort of, and this is probably one for the Q&A later, but you know, you get given the cards. I don't know how that phrase goes, but like there's certain cards that you're dealt that you'd better play correctly. And so it so happened that, as I mentioned, I didn't mention this, but I did mention that my publicist is excellent. His name is Brendan Fredericks. He's also my literary agent, and we can talk about that in the Q&A later. But you know, we're good mates. We're very close, and that's his skill, is being able to get word out about a book. And you know, at a certain point, regardless of how shy, introverted, and non-publicity loving the author is, they'd better get on board, because, you know, we don't live in that world that Marcus Zusak described as of 10 years ago. So yeah, it came with a lot of teeth gnashing and, you know, weird feelings, but I've since come to embrace it. It's interesting to hear. Yeah, it's interesting to hear your thoughts around that, because I'm always interested in how the author is perceived as a public person. And I mean, again, we can talk about that later.
Sorry, my dog is being like very, very bitey right now. Bitier than she's been in the 3 weeks she's been living with me. So that kind of actually answers one of the questions I was going to ask, which is about like advice or insights you would give particularly to young writers. So I might ask what was going to be my follow-up to that, which is, what piece of advice that people give to young writers do you think is bad advice? Not even
I hate that this is recorded.
Just advice that gets kind of thrown around a lot that you actually haven't found helpful.
I think that and I apologize for the long pause, but something is brewing in my head. Don't not okay, simultaneously submit is the key thing. So if anyone gives you advice around like, oh, you should reach out to one agent and then wait for their their response, and if it's a no, then you'll go on to the next one or the next couple, you're gonna spend your entire life waiting. And I recognize this as someone who did things in not exactly in that way, but was trying to honor the spirit of that. I did end up waiting a very, very long time. And I think the waiting was ultimately good for me, but only because I forced myself to see it that way. What I mean is, if you're sure of the work, and if you're not sure of it, there are ways to get sure of it, which is, get more beta readers, interrogate the work, revise it endlessly. But once you get to the point where you are sure of the work, then you don't need to shotgun every agent that's out there and every publisher, but have a clear timeline around what you want to be spending the next few months of your life doing, because that can turn into the next few years of your life. And if a lot of that is waiting and dealing with rejection, then people say, oh yeah, here's the actual bad advice, quote unquote bad advice. It's not bad per se. It's actually quite good, but there's a caveat that I want to add to it. The advice is, when you're on submission, write the next book. I tend to think that's really good advice, but I want to add something to that, which is, if you can, like if you have the mental capacity to do so, because not everyone does, and because it puts a lot of pressure on the creative to think about the next work when they don't even know what is happening with their current work. So I think the thing that I like in terms of advice that I give people along those lines is, if you can, and if you're dying to write the next thing, then absolutely, that's the correct thing to do. But the more correct thing to do is to protect your mental health and take care of yourself. And so if the way that manifests is not to write, then don't write. Because it's a weird industry that we're in and that we're obsessed with, that ultimately is actually quite apathetic towards us sometimes. And you can sort of tie yourself up in knots worrying about all of this stuff, when in fact, so the way that I describe it is, and I definitely felt this way, you spend years getting good at the craft, and that's your marathon, and you finish the manuscript and you have finished the marathon. But there's another marathon that you had spent no time preparing for, and that's how to get your book published. And then after that, there's a third marathon, which is what to do about your book once it is published. So it's just endless marathons. And I guess with that in mind, knowing that it is a long road and a long slog, I think the thing to lean into, which tends to help me in terms of my own work and quelling anxiety, is just to go back to first principles of like, why are we in this industry in the first place? Why are we creatives? Why do we create? And I guess I'll say that I never felt more miserable than when the work that I had completed was on submission, was getting rejected, and I was waiting for more rejections. And I never felt better and more protected, even within that emotional space. This is absolutely true. I never felt better than when I was working on something I really cared about. So if you can write the next work while you're waiting on submission, do it. But that's not going to be possible for everyone. And the key thing is to just take care of yourself.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. I also think there's a lot of pressure on people to do things very quickly, but doing things quickly is not always the best way to do it. We are about out of time, so we might wrap things up there. But I'd like to thank everybody who has attended tonight and who's watching the recording in the future. And thank you, of course, to Siang. If you haven't already read his work, I would encourage you to do so. I'd also like to remind you that this session will be available on YouTube as a resource and will be captioned in the coming days. If you would like to revisit any of tonight's, sorry, my dog is, so if you would like to revisit any of tonight's conversation, it will be captioned in the coming days. If you've enjoyed this, please check out the archive of Toolkits live talks on the Express Media YouTube in the live tab and the Toolkits playlist. There are over 70 talks from previous Toolkits guests. Thank you so much for coming along, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. And so are we just jumping on the next link?
Yeah.
The separate one. All right, well, I'll see you and others shortly.
Yes, see you then.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.